Hello and welcome to Bristol Reptile Emporium's YouTube channel. I'm Gail.
And I'm Michelle.
And today we are going to talk about tarantulas. Now we're not going to talk about one individual, it's going to be more of an overview of all tarantulas. So Michelle, first of all, we can see you're holding something in your hand. Can you tell us what this is?
Okay, so this is a molt or an exoskeleton of a tarantula that has increased in size. And unlike us, when invertebrates increase in size, they don't lose bits of their skin all the time. So every time we touch something, we leave a little bit of us behind because that's how our cells work. They're constantly replacing themselves. In order for an invertebrate, which tarantulas fall into that group of animals, to increase in size, they have to take the whole top layer off in one go. Now, when you've got quite a large species, like this particular one is, it's quite a big ordeal, and obviously it leaves us the remaining skin. So some new tarantula owners can be quite shocked if they've got a medium-sized tarantula as their first pet and they've never had one before, because when the animal molts, they'll look in the enclosure and it almost looks like you've got two tarantulas. And it's just literally where they physically increased in size, they've taken the top layer off, discarded it, it's no good to them anymore, so they'll just leave that. And in some cases you'll have a whole molt, and it'll look pretty good, and that's what we've got here.
That does look really good. It's nice to be able to see it as a whole, as one spider. Great. So obviously I know we're talking about all tarantulas, not one species, but is there a general lifespan of tarantulas?
So the thing to bear in mind is that females always live longer than males. So in the tarantula world, the girls do pretty well, whereas the boys are a bit less lucky, unfortunately. So it can be almost 3 times the lifespan for a female to male. So most males, we would hope to get in the region of 5 to 8 years out of a male. And some females can push over 25 years. And it really does vary species to species. So you'll hear me say this quite a lot throughout this video, that you need to check your species type and you need to communicate if you're looking into buying a new species or obtaining a new species, that you need to do plenty of research on that individual species, because there are loads of different tarantulas. They come in all different shapes, all different colours, all different sizes. So you need to make sure that you research the individual species to ensure that you fully understand the requirements for that tarantula.
Okay. And what sort of size will tarantulas get to?
So like I said, they vary massively. So some of the smaller species could be, something like about the diameter of a tennis ball, if that makes sense. So bottom of a mug sort of size, average coffee mug sort of size. However, some of the bigger species, so this is from a salmon pink, so this is one of the larger bird-eating species, but there are still examples that get bigger than this as well. So they vary massively.
Right, okay.
And also, enclosure size will vary with that too.
So what type of food do we give the tarantulas?
So they're a predatory insect, so they need live food, and obviously the size of the live food is going to be reflected in comparison to the size of the spider. So if you have a very small spider, you're going to be feeding smaller live food, and as the animal increases in size and molts, you will then increase the size of the live food. Do need to go careful with our live food. It needs to be gut loaded, because large crickets can be problematic with tarantulas. We need to make sure that they're not likely to attack them, so it's something that we need to be mindful of. However, a hungry spider normally won't give the live food chance to have a problem with it, and it will devour it within seconds, normally shocking the owner at the speed that it can actually grab its food at.
Right, okay. And how often do you feed the spider?
So again, that's going to vary depending on the size of the spider and what point it's at within a molt cycle and things like that. There's no real definitive, it should definitely be fed that frequently. We've got some individuals who come into our store that feed a lot more regularly than I do as a tarantula owner, so I aim to feed between once and twice a week. But if a tarantula is absolutely full with food, because there's lots of food available in captivity that there wouldn't be in the wild, they will go on prolonged periods where they don't take anything in at all. And I've had customers, and in cases with my own collection, where I've had tarantulas refuse to feed for months on end because they're like, no, I don't need to feed. I'm not in a molt cycle at the moment. I don't need that nutrients for any other reason. I'm just on tick over. So you know what? I just don't need it. And that's down to the individual animal. So that's something we've got to be mindful of when we're feeding, that we're not overdoing it, because obviously that live food will harass the animal in its enclosure.
Okay. So can you handle a tarantula?
Okay, now this is a massive bone of contention, as are a number of things within the world that we work in, basically. So it really depends on you and your tarantula. Now there are two different types of tarantulas, grouping of tarantulas, and we refer to them as old world and new world, okay? So old world species are ones that are found obviously from the older continents, so things like India, Asia. New world species come from the Americas. Now, old worlds have particularly potent, if I can get the word out, venom. Now, all tarantulas contain venom. The venom toxicity varies species to species, but if it generally comes from the old world, it has a higher toxicity level. Now, when I started keeping tarantulas, most people would never handle an old world species. However, you will see people on YouTube now that do handle, not just YouTube, but you'll see them across social media platforms as a whole, that do handle their old world species. One of the most common old world species that you'll see handled is Indian ornamentals. Now, I would take it on your individual spider whether you should handle it or not, and how brave you are. If you want to go for it, fine, but take into account the fact that the toxicity is high, and if you get bitten, down to you as an individual, your reaction can vary quite dramatically. Now, animals that come from the America, the toxicity is, in some species, seen to be lower, which encourages people to handle these types of species. And some of them are a lot more docile as well. So things like Mexican red knees, Chili roses, there are traditional docile species that we would recommend to beginner hobbyists. And these are far more likely to be handled, and you will see them being handled possibly if you go to displays and things like that at zoos. And again, it is something that you need to be mindful of. And some people won't handle any species at all, and some people are okay with the more docile ones. So it's kind of down to you. Look at the body language that your tarantula is displaying when you go to interact with the animal. But there are lots of variants, so do take care if you are considering doing it. And yeah, just be mindful that, like bees and wasps, one person's reaction to a venom or sting may be very different to another person's.
Okay. What type of housing would we house the tarantula in?
So it's going to depend on what, how the animal likes to position itself. So within tarantulas, as a group of individuals, we have some that prefer to position themselves on the bottom of the enclosure, so they're terrestrial, and then we have some which we class as arboreal, which like to position higher up within an enclosure. So for something like the salmon pink, we have a floor-based enclosure, whereas for something like an Indian ornamental, we would have height in the enclosure with probably a smaller footprint. And the size of the enclosure will vary depending on the life point that the tarantula is at. So if we've got a massive enclosure, it makes it harder for us to identify whether a very small spider or spiderling is. And it also makes it harder for it to find its food and things like that. So we increase the size enclosure as the animal grows. And yeah, the type of enclosure will again come back to your individual species that you're looking to keep, and also where it likes to position itself within the environment that it's in.
Do we need to provide heat?
Yeah, so obviously tarantulas are not found in the UK, and us as Bristol Reptile Emporium are based in Bristol in the UK. So generally there are points in the year where we can get close to the sort of natural conditions that they're found in, but for the most part we need to provide additional heat sources. And those will vary depending on the size of the enclosure, obviously the species that you're keeping and where it originates from. So we may be using low wattage equipment like heat mats and things like that, or if you've got a large enclosure and you need a higher temperature, you may decide that you want to use different bits of kits, things like ceramics and stuff like that, to get up to the temperature parameter that the animals require. But that will vary in case to case. Household temperature will have an effect on it too.
Right, okay. And do we provide light?
So most invertebrates aren't that keen on light. Again, that varies. It's not sweeping generalisation, so don't pin me against the wall with, oh my god, I can't believe she just said that. So at the moment, we generally don't provide much additional lighting. It's primarily like the lighting that we'd find in the room that we're housing the animal in.
Right, okay. And what would you have on the bottom of the enclosure?
So again, this is going to vary depending on the species, but there are some substrates which are manufactured now generally for broad spectrums. So we've got things like ProRep produce a product called Spider Life, which is a pre-mixed substrate. It's made up of a couple of different materials, which is good for quite a number of different species of tarantula. But there's also things like cocoa fibre. Some people will use wood chips. And again, it's about having a go with these products, seeing which you prefer as an individual. If you don't like them for whatever reason, swapping out and trying something different.
Great. And do we provide water?
So they are invertebrates. We have talked previously on some of the other videos about how invertebrates breathe, and if they fall into large volumes of water, they can basically drown because of how they take the oxygen into their system. So we may provide a small dish. Normally it's smaller than the leg span of the tarantula, so that they can actually stand up and get out of the dish if they need to. Alternatively, we can put a dish in which has got something that works so that they can, kind of like an island, that's the easiest way to describe it. So that might be a pebble, or it could be, I mean, when I started doing it, we used to use cotton wool. Some people will frown against that now because it's fibrous, it can get stuck on the tarantula. But there are also options of using things like the hydrogelly that we use with the live food to keep them hydrated. You can introduce that to maintain your humidity levels as well.
Okay. And do we put any hides or any sort of ornaments in with the enclosure?
So again, depending on the species that you're keeping, you can incorporate decoration that will make them feel more safe and more secure. So if it is a terrestrial species, we can use hides. If it's an arboreal species, we can use foliage, or even things like big pieces of cork bark so they can get in between. It depends where they're found in the wild and the look of the enclosure that we're trying to mimic.
Okay, great. Is there anything else that we need to know about tarantulas?
So obviously I've mentioned about the toxicity of tarantulas and saying that they are all venomous. Now the other thing that I didn't mention was, I was talking a lot about old world species and their toxicity, but I didn't mention much about the new world species and the counter that they have to the milder toxicity. Obviously, as I say, this varies in individual case. It will also vary with you as an individual owner too. But New World species have irritant hair on the body, which is kind of how they've evolved slightly differently to the Old World ones. So they don't have the overall toxicity level, but the irritant hair is designed to keep them safe too. So what they can do is some species can actually flick hair with the hind legs off the abdomen. So obviously we need to go careful of that when we're working with them. Also, when you're cleaning out an enclosure that's got a tarantula in, be mindful that if you are sensitive to the hairs may be in the enclosure, and you may still get a slight reaction from the substrate. And in some cases, it can be so severe for some people that even if a tarantula was to walk on your skin, you would see marks where the feet had been. So you do need to take care with the irritants, and even the molts can still be irritant after the tarantula has shed it. So if you go into an enclosure and pick it up, you can have a reaction. And if you think, oh, these are awesome, they're great, I think my kids should take them to school as a learning tool, and they have them in a tub, and then they take the tub out, and then in front of all their mates, they take the spider out and have it on their hands. Obviously, everyone that comes in contact with that molt could have a reaction to it. So just be aware of this and think what you need to do to stop, if you're sensitive to it, or the likelihood of somebody is being sensitive to it, this from happening. Because obviously, although it's just an irritant for some people, depending on your skin, the severity of it can vary quite dramatically.
Okay, good information. Thank you for watching Bristol Reptile Emporium's YouTube channel.
Don't forget to subscribe, and we look forward to seeing you next week for another video. Bye!
Bye!